All right, so last week we were in the story of Joseph. We're kind of in the midst of that right now. And we saw what we call the big reveal, right? After 22 years of being separated from his family, Joseph was able to reveal to his brothers that not only was he still alive, which of course that would be amazing to them, but God orchestrated, God used the situations that he found himself in all those years for the express purpose of saving his family, saving Jacob, his father, saving all of his brothers, saving all the rest of his family. Now, when we last met, the brothers, they had come back to Canaan, right? Joseph had sent them back to Jacob, his father, and told him, hey, not only is Joseph still alive, but he's somehow, through a sequence of events, he is now the governor of over all of Egypt, right? All of the land. And now Joseph's calling his family back to come back to Egypt because there's going to be another 5 more years of famine. I want to protect you. That's basically his whole premise. We want to kind of give you a place to stay. So we're moving into what we would call the last chapters of Genesis. And in these chapters, you see the last chapters of a family, we're going to be moving from a family, as history goes forward, into a nation. Israel is going to go from being a family of 70 or so people to becoming a nation of a multitude. But to do that, they're going to have to go through affliction. But that's what lies ahead. So we got some stories still left to finish. So in our time tonight, we're going to see the family finally, again, moving down to Egypt. Jacob reunited with his son, Joseph. So we're going to jump right in, chapter 46. And so Genesis chapter 46. And we're going to look at 3 chapters. It's a lot to cover. I know the way I cover them. It's like, okay, it's going to be a lot. So we're going to go through it. But chapter 46 is some genealogy, so we're not going to cover necessarily all the genealogies. Anyway, verse 1, let's jump right into it. It says, so Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Jacob. So here Jacob is heading out to Egypt, but he stops. What's that?
God of his father, Isaac.
Isaac. What did I say? Jacob? I said Jacob again. I get all these names all mixed up, Okay, God of his father Isaac. So Jacob heads out, but he stops in Beersheba. Now you think about Beersheba. Beersheba is where Isaac, his father, and his family had set up. So this would have been, first of all, Jacob's upbringing. This would have been his hometown. This is where he grew up. Okay. As well, Beersheba was also the place, if you kind of remember the history of Genesis, where both Abraham, his grandfather, and Isaac, his father, called on the name of the Lord. So think of all those things. That would have been, Beersheba was very significant for Jacob because it would have been a very special place in his heart spiritually, right? So as well, Beersheba was the kind of, as you're heading out of Canaan, it would have been the last kind of stop, last kind of outpost before you kind of head out into the wilderness. So it's a good place to stop anyway as well for that reason. And so it says Israel took his journey to Beersheba. So I love that because Israel, we know Jacob, God renamed him Israel, right? So they're using the name Israel right now for Jacob. Israel needed to seek the Lord. So he went to the place that he felt the Lord would meet him, right? His grandfather met the Lord there. So God did meet him there. Look at verse 2. Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Now, we'll stop there because the first thing I want you to see is when God speaks to him, right? It says Israel. God spoke to Israel, but when he speaks to him, he says, Jacob, Jacob. We talked about how when God uses when we see in the Bible the term Israel being used for Jacob, there's good things going on. When the Jacob is being used, it's not always necessarily good things going on. And so here's the thing. Israel is on the right track as far as him as a person going to where God wanted him to go. And yet, we're going to see, as he's going, there's fear in his heart. He's afraid. That's Jacob being afraid. That's the old man, so to speak. And so when God speaks to Jacob, first he says, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt. Interesting, because when he says, I am God, the word God is the Hebrew word El, right? El is very familiar because the other word that we use for God in the Old Testament especially is Elohim. And we talked about this at the very beginning of Genesis. Elohim is that word for God, but it is actually a plural word, right? It's El is singular, Allah is God, two, and then Elohim is three or more. And we talked about how that pointed to the Trinity, right? So, but this case, God uses El. Now, the interesting thing about El and what it means you could just translate it God as it is here, but it can also mean God of the nations or mighty one. And it also could be translated or understood as hero. So think about that. God was speaking comfort. He was seeking to speak encouragement to Jacob as he was fearful. And he says, I am Jacob, I am the mighty one, right? I am the Lord of the nations. You don't have to worry about Egypt because I'm the Lord of the nations, plural, right? And then he goes, I'm your hero. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to be with you, he says. I'm going to go with you. I'm going to take you down there. I'm going to be with you every step of the way. And again, he says, of course, we know why he said all these things, because Jacob had fear. He says, do not fear to go down to Egypt. Now, you might ask yourself, why was Jacob afraid to go down to Egypt? Well, to Jacob, Egypt meant some bad things, worldliness, bad things, right? Because if you think about it, his grandfather, Abraham, remember when he went down to Egypt? Not a good situation, right? Because when he went down there, he told him that to tell Sarah that you're not my wife, you're my sister. That didn't turn out too well. As well, when they were down in Egypt, they picked up a handmaiden by the name of Hagar, right? And through all of that whole situation, we had Ishmael and the whole problem with Ishmael and Hagar and so on. And so that was not a good situation. As well, in Genesis 26, God told Isaac at that point in time, Jacob's father, to not go down to Egypt, but to stay there in Canaan. And then lastly, God told Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, that eventually his descendants would end up in bondage for a certain period of time before they would be then ultimately delivered. So you think about all these different scenarios that were playing in Jacob's mind, whether it was just one or it was all of those things together, a combination, we can understand why Jacob was full of fear. And yet God was telling Jacob to go. Now, I know often we look at our past and where we came from, and we think of our past as the old life, right? And we tend to think, and rightly so, that we need to leave the old life behind. We need to leave the past behind us, the old life, right? And that's true. But sometimes, often, we even equate the old life with specific places. So, God maybe sometimes takes us out of specific places or around certain people or places that we were brought up and so on and so forth. And then God, sometimes, after all of that time, will actually call you back to the very same places that you went to, that you came out of, right? And as you leave it, and then you're coming back, you're like, oh, you're fearful, because you're thinking, well, what's going to happen? Am I, is it just going to be the same? Am I going to do the same kinds of things that I did before? What's going to happen? And as well, I realize that oftentimes when we look at Egypt and when we look at Egypt as what it means or what it stands for, figuratively speaking, Egypt represents worldliness, right? And so you think, well, why would God tell Jacob to go back, quote unquote, if Egypt represents worldliness, back into the world? Well, sometimes God calls us back where we came from. Why? So that we might then be a light to those dark places, to those places in the past that we came out of, we came from. But see, here's the thing. The difference before, when God told Jacob and Isaac and them to not go down to Egypt, the difference was he was still Jacob, right? Now he's Israel, right? In other words, he has changed, right? He's a new person. God has done a work in him, and he's different. And the same is for us, right? Because we know 2 Corinthians 6:17 tells us, wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, right? Come out from among them, be ye separate. So as believers, we're called to be, yes, different from the world, different from how everyone else acts. And more often than not, that means maybe, and for a lot of us, it means separate ourselves from our situation, even from people, places, things that caused us to stumble into sin. But then there may come a time, once we've been strengthened, once we've been changed, once we've been molded by God to a certain state in our lives, strong enough, if you will, then he'll call us back into that very place where we came from, so then we might then become a witness and someone who can be a light, right? I think of John 17, where Jesus is speaking, verse 15 and 16. It says, Jesus is praying. He says, I do not pray that you should, he's talking to the Father, that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of this world, just as I am not of the world. He's speaking about his own disciples, right? He says, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. And so what that's saying here, and within our text, what we're understanding is that phrase and how you put it into a kind of a summation, a statement. We're to be in the world, but not of the world. And so Jacob, yes, was being called down to Egypt, but he's not going to be of Egypt. And first of all, he's not Jacob. He's Israel, right? He's going down as Israel. And God would use Jacob, God would use Israel to shape a nation, So God encourages Jacob that God would be there with him, right? And that ultimately God would fulfill the promise that he ultimately first gave to Abraham, then to his father Isaac, and now to him, Jacob. That he's going to make him a great nation, right? And he's going to give him the land, right? He's going to bring them back eventually and give him that land. Now, he even encourages him that Joseph, which is a good incentive to continue, right? Because God knows our hearts, and he knows, trust me, all of those things are true that I just said, but also Joseph's going to be there. You want to see Joseph, right? And he's going to be there, and he's going to be there until you're going to be with him until you die, and he's going to put his hand over your eyes. That's the idea, like he's going to be there even at your death. Look at verse 5. He says, Then Jacob arose from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones, their wives, and the carts which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. So they took their livestock and their goods, which they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and went to Egypt. Jacob and all his descendants with him, his sons and his sons' sons, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his descendants he brought with him to Egypt. So they head all down, right, to Egypt. Now, the next several verses, again, as I said earlier a second ago, genealogies. I encourage you to read them, but just for sake of time, as well as personal embarrassment of reading all the names and butchering them, I'm going to skip over them. You can read them on your own, but we're going to jump down to verse 26. And it says, all the persons who went with Jacob to Egypt, who came from his body, besides Jacob's sons' wives, were 66 persons in all. And the sons of Joseph, who were born to him in Egypt, were 2 persons, all the persons of the house of Jacob, who went to Egypt were 70. Now, you notice there's a little difference there, because one says 66 and then the other one says 70, and somebody people say, well, there's a contradiction there. Come on in, guys. And so some people will say that's a contradiction, but in fact, if you think about it, all told is 70. The 70 includes Joseph and his family, right? And if you subtract the 4 of them, that would give you the 66, right? So even though Joseph was still in Egypt, there was a point where we're going to see in a moment that Joseph goes up to meet his family, and then they head on into Goshen to show them where Goshen is, right? So that's how we know that they all came into Egypt together. Verse 28, then he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out before him the way to Goshen. And they came to the land of Goshen. So Joseph made his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. So there's a very emotional reunion. This is the first time in 22 plus years that Jacob has seen his son since his brothers sold him into slavery. So he's just overjoyed. He's just ecstatic to know that he gets to see his son again, right? Verse 31, then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brother and those of my father's house who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for their occupation has been to feed livestock, and they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all that they have. So it shall be, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? That you shall say, your servant's occupation has been with livestock from our youth and even until now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. And then it adds this statement, for every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. So we get this idea here, right? Being a shepherd of sheep and so on is an abomination. So Joseph kind of is like saying, okay, let's be diplomatic about it. When they ask you, what do you do? What's your occupation? Don't say shepherding. Say livestock. He's just using a word that would be more diplomatic, more acceptable to them. Unfortunately, we're going to see that his instructions go unheeded. As we move into chapter 47, look at verse 1. It says, then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brothers, their livestock and their herds and all they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are all in the land of Goshen. And he took 5 men from among his brothers, so 5 of his brothers, presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, we and also our fathers. Wow, Joseph's probably going, I told you don't say shepherds, say. Anyway, we'll move on. Verse 4. And then they said, we have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pastures for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and your brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, make them chief herdsmen over my livestock. Now, it's interesting because Pharaoh's response to Joseph, when they said shepherds, and Joseph thought he was going to be kind of all upset. It appears that Pharaoh didn't even bat an eye, at their response. Okay, he's like, okay, you said shepherds, okay. And I would say, again, we've talked about this before, but that speaks directly to Joseph's influence on Pharaoh. We talked about before that how Joseph had an influence on all those around him, right? And remembering how Joseph mentioned to his brothers that he said, God has made me a father to Pharaoh, a father to Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh took their shepherd points, the shepherd comments, kind of through the lens, I would say, as of how he felt about Joseph. He took that. Now, I also do think it's interesting because he offered them like opportunities to be chief herdsmen. So it was almost like as if saying, "Okay, you're shepherds. We'll take that in stride, but we'll give you jobs and we'll straighten you. We'll get you kind of elevate you if that's possible on the right path. If that was the case, maybe that was his way of kind of helping the situation, whatever." But I think that sometimes, though, how the world thinks about serving the Lord, right? Egypt looked at being a shepherd as an abomination, as lowly, right? Taking care of the sheep. I think that's how the world looks at oftentimes at those that serve the Lord, right? Maybe some like myself, maybe service capacity as pastor of a church. But maybe it's just serving the Lord as a layperson in the church. The world looks at that as being kind of the lowest type of a situation, right? Like, oh, sir, like if you had the choice to do something more productive, sure, you should do that, right? And yet, what they don't understand, and what I believe, and I've come to know, is that serving the Lord, serving His people, is really the highest honor, right? It's the highest honor. It's that we can do in this life. You see stories in the past, maybe like in the 18th and 19th hundreds and stuff, where you see people would say, well, if you can't do anything else, hey, you got the ministry, right? Go into the ministry. That's kind of like the attitude that they would have, like, I'm not very good at it much. I'll go into the ministry. That was kind of the mentality that we've had in our cultures for so many years. And, people have treated it as such. But again, it's a high and it's a holy privilege, a high and holy calling. And so my prayer is that we would see it that way. We would see that it's not like, I had this happen. I see people, young people or even older people that say they really feel called to do ministry and their families look like them, like they're wasting their lives. Like, why would you want to do that? You went through all these years of college or this or that, and why would you want to just give all that up to do something like what? Serve the Lord? What's that? When really my prayer is that they would see it as the greatest calling that a person could have on their life, as far as whatever that means. Doesn't mean necessarily serving in an official capacity, but just serving the Lord in general, giving to Him our lives, allowing Him to use us is really the greatest fulfillment of our lives, right? To let God use us in this life. Verse 7 says, "Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, 'How old are you?'" I just thought that was awesome. "How old are you?" If you remember, I said a few weeks ago that I believe that this Pharaoh, for certain reasons, was a young Pharaoh, right? We even talked about how that would make it understandable when Joseph said, "God has made me a father to Pharaoh." But here, I think it's quite possibly another indication that this Pharaoh was still quite young, because, at least in my mind, only a young person would say to somebody, "How old are you?" Look at them and really just go, "You got wrinkles, and your wrinkles got wrinkles," kind of a thing, and just the way I look at it, if this Pharaoh was fairly young still, it would even cause Jacob to seem even that much older, right? Anyway, he asked him, "How old are you?" Jacob says in verse 9 to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. And I think it's very interesting that what we just read there. It says Jacob blessed Pharaoh. He blessed Pharaoh. That means he actually said a prayer. He prayed a blessing over Pharaoh. You think about that, because Pharaoh is a pagan king, right? In fact, most pharaohs believed that they were gods themselves, right? And yet Jacob recognizes the blessings of God coming through even this pagan king, that God was using him, and he blessed him. I think of that passage, or I think of what God said to Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant. I will bless those who bless you, right? I will bless those who bless you. You know, I remember an experience years ago. I was working at this company, and I had this manager over me, and I don't even really remember what he did, but I remember wanting to witness to him and share with him, and I had it multiple times. But this one particular occasion, he did something nice for me. He did something kind of to kind of bless, I guess you could say, my life, although he wasn't a believer. And so I told him, I said specifically, I'm going to pray for you that God would bless you in a very specific way. And so I did. I prayed over the weekend. And lo and behold, that guy came to me after the weekend on Monday, and he just came right up to me. He said, man, I don't know what you did, but this happened to me. And he knew when I talked to him about, you know, about praying for him, he knew that what happened to him was connected to what I had said, that I was going to pray for him, right? And so I just thought, man, what a way, if you think about it, what a way to show people that God is real, right? I mean, who doesn't want to be blessed, right? Who doesn't want to receive good things, right, in their lives? So, you know, to tell somebody you're going to pray for them that God would bless them, especially that they've blessed you, and so on. Verse 11, and Joseph situated his fathers and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread according to the number in their families. Now, this whole description of this area was the Nile Valley. The land of Goshen was in the Nile Valley. If you can even look on a Google Earth and you look at the Nile Valley, that right where the Mediterranean comes into Egypt, it's green, right? It's all green, even still today. So that's the area that they were going to, the luscious part, and the rest of Egypt is like a desert, right? So they were getting basically the best part of Egypt, most fertile. And of course they needed that for their flocks and so on. But for them, think about this, because this was, to start with, a huge blessing to be in this particular area, to have this land at their disposal. But we're going to see when we move to Exodus, it became a bone of contention and an envy for the rest of Egypt. Right? Now, the next several verses, they deal with Joseph and his oversight of Egypt, because he still had the oversight of all the grain and everything, and all the people coming from the various countries and the areas in the region to get grain and so on and so forth. So he still had a lot of work to do. But look at verse 13. It says, now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe. So the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's household. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us bread. Why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed. There's no more money left, right? Then Joseph said, well, give your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock if the money is gone. So think about this. Joseph, being a shrewd overseer of all the situation, he gets all the money, right? And now he's getting all their people's livestock. Right? And we go even further, verse 17. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for their horses, their flocks, their cattle of the herds, for the donkeys. Thus he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. Now, when that year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord that our money is gone. My lord also has our herds of livestock. There's nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and Pharaoh? Give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. For every man of the Egyptians sold his field because the famine was severe upon them, so the land became Pharaoh's. So you think about what Joseph's doing here, right? He says all the money, boom, goes to Pharaoh. All the livestock, boom, goes to Pharaoh. All the land, boom, goes to Pharaoh. Listen, as a governor, he wasn't just a good governor, he was a good businessman, right? And you can see what he's doing here. And think about this. Joseph's job, right, was to work for the king, right? That's what the king hired him, if you will, to do, gave him the position to do. And he was doing just that. In fact, before all is said and done, Joseph is he's not necessarily even just going to make Egypt rich. He's going to make the Egyptian king, the Pharaoh, probably one of the richest men in all the world, right? Because he's kind of taken advantage of the whole situation. And if you think about this, because this is actually a continuation of what we saw in Joseph's life all throughout this time in Egypt, right? When he was with Potiphar, he made Potiphar blessed, right? He made, whatever he did, he caused Potiphar to gain and be blessed by what he was doing. And then he was sent to the prison, and even the captain of the prison, I don't know how you can do that in prison, but somehow he was able to make the captain of the prison blessed in whatever he was doing. And it's just a continuation. Whatever he's doing, now it's the king of Egypt, and he's causing the king of Egypt to be blessed. And I think about that. That's the kind of witness that we should be, right? When we work, right? When we're working for a company or whatever, or a boss or whatever, we should seek to be a blessing to that business. Even if the boss is not a believer, or whatever, it doesn't matter. We should strive to be the hardest worker, the most honest, bringing blessings to that place because God has us there, right? That's a witness. That's a testimony, right? Whether our employer are believers or not, right? And so that means, and this is, maybe I'll step on some toes, who knows? But that means when it's time to work, it's time to work, right? In other words, sometimes we think, well, I'm there, I'm going to start sharing the gospel, I'm going to start witnessing while I'm supposed to be working, right? And I've seen it so many times, Christians say, oh man, they're persecuting me at work, they're coming down on me because I'm a Christian. No, they're not. They're just coming down on you because you're not working. You're spending time talking and you're not doing your job, right? And the truth is, listen, there are times when we can do that. Our breaks, at lunch, and I'm not even saying that there aren't times within our work day that you can share a little bit here or there, but never at the expense of doing what we're being paid to do, right? And even more so, to be a blessing to our employer, right? I mean, it should never shock anyone that we as believers, we're the employees of the month kind of a thing, because we're making them money, we're helping them, we're being a blessing to them. That's the kind of, think about it, that's the kind of witness Joseph was to Pharaoh, a pagan king, right? So that's what we should be doing. That's how we should be living. That's the kind of witness God calls us to be. Verse 21. And as for the people, he moved them into the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end, right? So they sold all their lands. They've got to work. They don't have any means to make money, so they move into the cities. That's where all the jobs are and so on, right? Verse 22, only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate the rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. So kind of even then, the church was exempt, if you will, Then Joseph said to the people, indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh. 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and for your food, for those of your household, and as food for your little ones. So they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, that's 20%, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So basically, the people, all that was left to give was themselves, right? They basically sold themselves, they've indentured themselves. You know what that is? It's being a slave, but it's not like, oh, I got taken to be a slave. It means you have no means of paying, so you kind of just voluntarily say, I'll be your servant because I have nothing else to give you. I'm going to sell you myself and be indentured to you. But here's the thing. Joseph was shrewd, right? Because he didn't even just think of that moment, right? For that moment, he was thinking of the future. And he said, basically, when you do get the grain and you start growing and you start doing the things, you're going to, in the future, you're going to be paying 20%, right? Like there's a tax. He's kind of invoking a tax on the people that even after they start getting, prospering a little more, that 20% always is going to come in, if you will, to the king. So basically, Egypt becomes a welfare state, right? It all belongs to the king. Everything is owned by the king, and they're all subject to the king. So think about this. Talk about being a blessing for your boss. I guarantee you that Pharaoh was like, I'm glad Joseph's on my side. He's a wise person, wise guy. He's a wise person. He's being a blessing. So at this point, we turn back to Jacob, verse 27. It says, So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there and grew and multiplied exceedingly. And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, Now if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And he said, I will do as you have said. Then he said, Swear to me. And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. Now it's interesting as well to think, because we've just talked about everybody coming to Joseph. It was a famine. Everything was really bad. They're selling themselves. They don't have anything left. At the same time, God says through his word, he says, Israel prospered, right? The families of Israel, they had cattle and everything. They prospered. While everybody was hurting, God's people were flourishing. And we even see that when we go to the Exodus, before the Exodus, when the 10 plagues come, that it was, the plagues were happening all to Egypt, but the people of Israel were all, God was taking care of, God was protecting them, right? So that's good, because that we are God's people. We need to know God's gonna take care of us. God's gonna provide for us. God's going to have us, cover us, right? Seek first the kingdom of God, and all of these things will be added unto you. That's a promise from the Lord. Now that put your hand under my thigh is always a weird thing, right? Like, okay, that's kind of yeah. Well, that was the way they made oaths in those days, because putting your hand on somebody's thigh is definitely a very intimate thing. It's a very personal thing, but it also is showing them that it's a very important thing, right? This is like you're going to do this. You don't do this lightly. I don't go around putting my hands under other people's thighs. This is a very, I'm gonna make sure that I remember this, and this is very important, right, to fulfill. And of course, Jacob didn't want to be buried in Egypt. He wanted his bones to be buried in Canaan, in the burial place that his family bought, right? So Joseph obliged with that. He swore that he would take his bones, and we'll see that later as we move along. So our last chapter, chapter 48. We'll kind of move through this fairly quickly. But verse 1 says, Now it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, Indeed, your father is sick, and he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And Jacob was told, Look, your son Joseph is coming to you. And Israel, it says, strengthened himself and sat up on the bed. Now I want you to know, it's important to note that this very situation, this whole situation, is actually mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, if you're not familiar, it's commonly called the Hall of Faith, because it's mentioning all the various Old Testament people that had faith in the Lord, faith in the promise. Then though they didn't receive the promise, they had faith, they endured, right? And Jacob is one of those mentioned. And in Hebrews 11:22, it says this, By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. So there's some important kind of nuances here, why that was mentioned. So I want to kind of unfold this and look at this, why it's important. And that tells us obviously that Jacob, when he goes forth doing this was out of faith, right? He understood this was God moving, and we're going to see why that's important to know that. But look at verse 3. It says, Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you. I will make of you a multitude of people and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. Now Luz, if you remember, right, it's the other name for Luz is Bethel. Bethel means house of God, right? And that is where, remember, when Jacob went out to go down to Laban to meet, eventually met his wives, but anyway, he's there in Luz, and he's asleep, and God comes to him in a vision, and he sees the ladder, right? And the ladder that was touching earth and heaven, and the angels are ascending and descending on it. And we talked about that ladder represented Christ. Well, he's now mentioning this, right? He's saying, remember that time, that is when God met me. God spoke to me, right? And at that moment, God passed on the Abrahamic covenant to Jacob. So he's mentioning this to Joseph. He's saying, listen, God has promised us, right, that we're going to be a multitude. As well, he's going to give us this land, the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession. So in a very real way, Jacob is passing on this blessing or this covenant to Joseph. He's speaking to him about that. But look at verse 5. It says, and now your two sons. It's very something interesting. Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, he says, are mine. They're mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. Reuben and Simeon were his first and second born, right? They were his first and second born sons. So he's saying they're mine. He says, your offsprings, whom you beget after them, they'll be yours. They will be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. But as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died beside me in the land of Canaan on the way, and there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So basically what's happening here is Jacob is taking Joseph's sons and he's adopting them. So they'll no longer be grandchildren or grandsons. Now they're going to be his sons, right? They're going to be his. And we see the importance of this and the significance of this because we understand that Ephraim and Manasseh become the figureheads, if you will, for tribes of Israel. We talk about the tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. They become two of those tribes. And we very rarely or hardly ever, if ever, see mentioned the tribe of Joseph, because Joseph is now split into two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, it's interesting because you say, well, wait a minute. There's 12 sons. Now Joseph split into two. Doesn't that make 13 tribes? Like, why do you always talk about the 12 tribes of Israel? How does that work? Well, we find out later that God claims the tribe of Levi for his own. And the tribe of Levi is where all the priests come from. And when they go into the promised land, we'll see that much later as we in the book of Joshua, they're not given an actual territory, right? They're basically said, they're mine. I am their territory, basically, the tribe of Levi. And so they're given a few cities here and there. They're also obviously they take care of the sanctuary, right? The tabernacle, and then eventually the temple in Jerusalem. So, but anyway, the 12 tribes then are everyone, including Manasseh and Ephraim, except for Levi, right? Verse 8, then Israel saw Joseph's son and said, who are these? As a grandpa would do, And Joseph said to his father, these are my sons whom God has given me in this place. And he said, please bring them to me and I will bless them. And it says, now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so he could not see. Then Joseph brought them near, and he kissed them, and he embraced them. Now we're going to see that even though his eyes physically were dim, that he physically couldn't see, Jacob could see very clearly, spiritually, very clearly. Verse 11, then Israel, again, it's going back and forth, Jacob, Israel, Jacob, Israel. This is the point here. Israel, this is very important, said to Joseph, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact, God has also shown me your offspring, right? Like, in other words, I didn't think I'd ever see you, let alone see your kids, my grandchildren. So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and he bowed down his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both. It says Ephraim with his right hand, right? So I'm like Joseph, right? And toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him, right? So you can get the picture here, right? So I'm facing Jacob. This is my right hand. That's his left hand. This is my left hand. That's his right hand. And he puts his son's position because he knows, well, Dad can't see very well. I'm going to make sure, because the right hand, when a person blessed, was like the better blessing, right? Was the firstborn's blessing. So he's going to position him just to make it really easy for him. He's going to say, you're going to bless him with your right hand, Manasseh, and Ephraim, you're going to bless him with your left hand, right? So you get the picture. He's walking up, right? And then it says this, though. Then Israel stretched out his right hand. So now I'm Jacob, or I'm Israel. Stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger. And then his left hand on Manasseh's head. And then it says, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. You're like, that looks really, really weird. But well, he had to do that because, when Joseph brought them up, he put them in the position. So it's like, well, okay, you're gonna put them that way? I'm gonna do it this way, kind of a thing. But let me just say this. This was no mistake. This wasn't Jacob just being all kind of like he's an old guy, he doesn't know what he's doing kind of here, right? This was no mistake. This was exactly what was meant to happen. In fact, look at verse 15. It says, then he blessed Joseph and said, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be named upon them. In other words, they're going to be my sons now. And the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in midst of the earth. So he's starting to bless, right? And then here's the thing. Joseph's like, wait, whoa, don't, no, you're already starting, but you got it wrong, right? Verse 17. Now when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took his hold of his father's hands to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. He's like, Dad, over here. Dad, no, over here. And Joseph said to his fathers, not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become, in other words, Manasseh, he'll become a people, right? He'll also be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you, Israel, I will bless, saying, may God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. And thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen something like that, right? It's happened several times now. We saw Jacob himself with Esau, right? He was the second. He was the younger. God placed him in front and above Esau. We saw it with Judah, with Tamar and their two children, the ones they had with Zerah and Perez. Perez stuck his hand out. They put the scarlet, thread on, and then they pulled his hand back, and Zerah came out, and it was the wrong one. Like, no, that was the wrong one, but that was the right one. Perez was the right one. He would be in the line of Christ. So the older would serve the younger. And here's the thing. Here's what we see as it takes place and as it kind of comes out, or as it kind of unfolds, I should say. We see that Ephraim the tribe becomes the dominant tribe in Israel, especially, right? We have that moment under Rehoboam, the king, during the times of the kings, where the tribe, the nation, the kingdom splits. And you got the southern kingdom and you have the northern kingdom, right? And oftentimes, throughout the scriptures, you'll see the northern kingdom even referred to as Ephraim. That's because Ephraim became the dominant tribe in the northern section. And that's all stemmed from right here. Verse 21, then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and my bow. Now, I think that's kind of interesting because, back when Joseph was younger and before all this happened and sold him into slavery, he kind of favored his son Joseph, right, with a coat of many colors. And you kind of see it a little bit here, right? A little bit like Jacob's like, Joseph, I'm giving you one extra portion, than your brothers. Your two sons are kind of giving you an extra place at the table, so to speak, right? So we see here, though, through all of this, the establishing of the 12 tribes. As we go forth, these are the established 12 tribes that we're going to get to come to know. And all of this is a prelude to God birthing or bringing forth the nation of Israel. Now, we've got one more study next week in Genesis, and we're going to see Jacob blessing each of his sons, and it's very important. There's going to be some significant moments in there we can look at, some insights, and then we'll have one more chapter after that, but then we'll move on to the book of Exodus, where we get to actually see the nation come forth as a real nation, the nation of Israel. But having said that, let's pray.